So
Yeah, oh, for sure. All right, awesome. Um, so excited you could join me, Cindy. This is a really fun opportunity. Um, could you just introduce yourself? Tell me a bit about your work at Toddle and how you got there.
totally. I think it's so fun to do this like co-release thing, and it's really weird to be on the other side of it. But I'm Cindy Blackburn, and I'm the director of learning and engagement at Toddle. My teaching journey was, I was one of those weird kids in preschool who like knew I wanted to be a teacher. By middle school, I knew I wanted to be an international teacher. Got bachelor's in teaching and jumped right into classrooms in Florida. And I was handed a script, and I was told, okay, your principal's going to come to observe you. And if the classroom next door is on page 12 when he's observing, you should be on page 13 when he walks into your door. And something about that just like really didn't jive. So I went back to school to get my master's in global and comparative ed to ask the question, how do the best schools in the world do it differently? And through that, found the IB, taught abroad for 10 years, Albania, China, Thailand, and Madagascar as a grade 1 teacher, grade 5 teacher, PYP coordinator. And that's kind of how I found Toddle. I was starting to make resources for my teachers and putting them out there online. And they really found me and said, hey, we like what you're doing. Can you come make this stuff for us? Um, and so that was the partnership with Toddle. And I work with them full time as their director of learning and engagement. So all the webinars, podcasts like this, ebooks, workshops, I just get to teach teachers around the world. It's the coolest job ever.
That is a really cool job. I'm jealous of the. Well, it is. It's the creativity that I love. I love one thing I love about teaching is being able to be creative
Yeah,
and be creative with the students, be creative in my own work. And we're going to talk about curriculum, and that's an area where creativity, I think, is a key disposition. Um, and I imagine in your work you get to have a lot of creativity. We'll
it's
have
so
to
fun.
we'll have to chat like Balkans. I lived in Macedonia, right next door to Albania, for a while,
Oh
so we
my
can.
gosh. Like,
Right.
just if anybody gets a chance to go to the Balkans, like Albania, Macedonia, like you drink wine from the vineyards of Alexander the Great, and it's like
Hmm.
€7 a bottle,
And
and
they
you're
all
just
and they made it in their garage or wherever. It's like
like,
it's all homemade.
Where am I? It's heaven, but yeah,
So you're the host of the School Leaders Project
yeah.
podcast, which is a really excellent podcast.
Oh, thanks
You
so much.
have some really incredible minds on your show talking about some really important things. It's interesting. I just want to share this with you. Like when I started my podcast, the thing that has continued to surprise me is how willingly people come on the show. People always say yes.
Yes, well, because we're all educators, and I think there's like this almost belief that like when you become like an edu star, that's what I call like Ron Richard and all
Hmm.
the edu stars. You think of them as these almost like immortal beings or like, but at the end of the day, they are just teachers and they're just people. And it's so cool to talk to them and just and realize that they have questions too and things they're learning about. And they're just the funnest people to talk to.
Yeah, and that's it, right? They're curious. Those curious minds is part of what got them to their where they are, and they want to talk with new people all the time. Yeah.
That was like the
Um,
driving thing with the podcast. I was like, I don't want it to feel like me explaining things or mansplaining things or like I always wanted to come at every guest with just like a question and a curiosity that I genuinely wanted to know about. So I hope that
mhm.
comes through on the show. Just like I'm so excited and nerding out to be learning with these folks. So
Yeah,
yeah, it brings me a lot of joy.
no, it definitely comes through. I really like your show.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
I wanted to talk about curriculum. That's originally why I reached out to you at Toddle, because progressive schools have an interesting history, interesting relationship with curriculum.
Yes.
I was a long time IB educator, not at an IB school now, but at a progressive school. Going through the process of wondering what this curriculum thing's all about and how we can make it more efficient and do a better job of it. In your episode with Rachel French, she says curriculum isn't a dirty word.
Yeah.
But, but why does it sometimes feel like that when we're in schools, particularly progressive schools?
It's such a beautiful question. And I think it's so interesting because you and I both come from the same world. We both come from the IB world where there is language and culture around curriculum and being curriculum builders. And I think coming back to independent schools in the US, that's been this theme that's emerged, is this tension that emerges between autonomy and structure. Because I think the majority of teachers in these schools are coming from public school, or a lot of them are coming from public school, where curriculum is kind of a dirty word. It's what I experienced in Florida. It's where you get this script and you
Mhm.
have no teacher agency or autonomy, and you're not a creator. You're not responding to your students. You're just being told what to do and to tick a box. So I think often when we hear curriculum, there are a lot of misconceptions that come up of overstuffed curriculum and over focus on testing. Um, of cold, dry standards that aren't responsive to our learners, and ultimately of scripted purchase programs that just like sap the soul out of teaching. Would you say that that is like a fear you see in your schools too?
For sure, I think that,
Mhm.
you talked about teacher autonomy,
Yeah,
and I think to many teachers that is one of the main anchors of their profession.
right.
Working with students, of course, and feeling like they're making a difference. But we all know that teachers are not doing this for the financial compensation necessarily.
No?
And so when
Okay.
you start looking at when you start looking at why teachers are so dedicated, I think autonomy, or at least the promise of autonomy, is one of them. I can
Mm,
certainly teachers I've worked with and myself, and as soon as you start talking about curriculum, I think there is that fear that there's going to be something forced on them, some standards they have to check.
right.
And suddenly the classroom doesn't feel like an authentic creative place. It feels like a drudgery through a list of I can statements.
That have to be written on your board.
Oh, yes, of course. If you don't have the to-do list or the
Yeah,
today's goals, then the
you're
principal will
failing.
dock you. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, and I think that to Rachel's point about it being a dirty word, I think some teachers do get a little bit, um, even cynical. I think sometimes because they wonder what's the relationship between the students they know on a
Mm.
one-on-one basis and this sort of top-down curriculum, when actually teachers should be involved in developing curriculum.
Totally. Well, and I think also in independent schools, you kind of go the other way of teachers being like, well, this is what I know what I teach. I know what grade nine World Civ looks like. And why are you checking on me? Like, do you think I'm not capable of figuring out what is worth teaching and learning and knowing? And I think that's another tension, is just in the effort to make things visible and collaborative and intentional, it feels like handcuffs, or it feels like micromanaging.
Hmm. Yeah. So you taught overseas
Mm,
in the IB. And international schools are interesting creatures, and
yes, they are.
The IB is a very fascinating um, program. And I'm curious, how did you find the curriculum development, curriculum delivery in your international schools? What
Ooh,
was,
I want to tread lightly here, but I think there is this
yeah,
piece that, like, you walk into these schools that have been around for 20 or 30 years, and you're like, let's see your curriculum. And it's a weird, like, dusty Google Drive folder that is just chaos, or nothing exists at all. And you're kind of like, what's been happening? And like what I found is that oftentimes it lived with teachers. And so when teachers left, the curriculum walked out the door with them. And so it was a lot of reinventing the wheel. It seems like every 2 or 3 years as teachers turned over, and there was like skeletons, there's like clues of things that were done. And as well, in grade two, we do plants. And you're like, why do we do plants? No one knows, but there's a Google Drive that says. So I think
my God.
that has been a cool thing of working with Toddle, is that that's the goal that it seeks to undo. That, like, have you heard of the hit by the bus principle?
I don't know if I have.
Okay, I love it. It's like, how many people would have to be hit by a bus until the culture in your school died, basically? And
Uh,
your goal is to make it as many people as possible. That, like, if I left the school, and if the principal left the school, and if 10 teachers left the school, is there enough documentation? Is there enough structure in place that, like, the heart of the school lives
mm,
on?
mhm.
And so I think that's kind of I don't know, the goal of curriculum documentation is creating a stronger blueprint of what your school is, what we teach, and what's worth learning.
Oh, we just were talking about this in my school. About
Mm,
the curriculum has to live on beyond teachers.
yeah,
And so often we, especially in some of these independent schools, you get these incredible teachers that have created these courses that are so rich, but you do kind of find
amazing.
yourself wondering if that person leaves, is any of it going to remain? And I
Right.
think often the answer is no.
And that's how you wind up in these Frankenstein schools where you talk to a kid in fifth grade and they're like, yeah, we've done three plants units, or we've done ancient civilizations four times. And it's like, oh man, what a bummer. What other beautiful inquiries there are that exist. But if every teacher is just kind of bringing in what they know and teaching the units they've taught, there's not that continuity. There's not that vertical and horizontal
Hmm,
intentionality.
yeah. I do want to talk about Toddle in a bit because it
Hmm.
is a really impressive tool. When I first started teaching, um, it was 2010, and as far as I know, as far as I remember, the only show in town was Manage Back. And even in 2010, it was dated, right? That was a very dated program. No offense out there to the Manage Back people, but
Back.
it was
But it's
already a
tricky.
little
I mean,
hard to
you gotta
use.
evolve. You're at tech, you have to evolve.
Well, that's it, right? I even for the several years after that, remember just thinking like, well, this is what happens when you don't have competition. I mean, this is like a case study for the need for competition. And so when
Mhm.
Toddle came along, it was like, wow, like it was a really breath of fresh air for the IB. Um, but back to this, you talk about how the kids who get the plant unit every year, right? The Frankenstein school. I really enjoyed this conversation you had with Heidi Jacob Hayes about
Oh, Heidi Hayes
curriculum
Jacobs is
mapping, but
gorgeous.
particularly storytelling and this idea that your curriculum should tell a story. Um, could you talk a bit more about that? What you gleaned from her about that? It's really fascinating and much more difficult than it first seems. I was doing a little digging around after listening to that episode, and it's like this is amazing, but this would be a big project for a school.
So I definitely suggest Heidi and Allison Zamuda put out a book through the ASCD, and it's all about that idea of storytelling, storyboarding our curriculum by streamlining it.
Mhm.
That it can become really hard to tell the story of learning when we have like these giant unit planners, these giant POIs that are program of inquiry for IB schools that are unreadable. And what she encourages teachers to do is to really synthesize it down into the big ideas and to intentionally place the curriculum in ways that build towards connection making, right?
Mhm.
So even if I'm going, let's say, from plants to civilizations, how do I make that transition smoother, right? That students are able to tell the story of what they learned here and take little pieces of it forward. Like you said, it's an incredibly complex process, but it's so powerful because it empowers not just teachers to see the connections, but students and families as well, getting everybody telling that same story of learning. I liken it like out of all the conversations with Heidi, the metaphor that reigns with me is thinking of curriculum like a blueprint, and that you might have a team of really creative architects all building a house together. But if they're not talking to each other, you are going to wind up with a house with seven bathrooms and no kitchen, right? The
Mhm.
10 plants units and no civilization. So the goal in curriculum mapping and in curriculum storyboarding is just to get everybody seeing not only the story of their year, but like this collection of novels that we're creating together and making sure that we have a balanced library so that our kids are able to go out and be successful in the world.
Mhm.
Lots of metaphors there.
Yeah, it was well said though. Yeah, it's I found it easy to relate to. I'm a history teacher. And so
Yeah,
that it's a story. The whole thing's a story. And so
story.
sort of looking at it from a 6 to 8, 9 to 12, K to 12. But where it started to get fuzzier for me was sort of in math. I mean, I guess math is always tends to be a sort of a sticking point when it
Math
comes
and
to
music.
curriculum. But it really is an interesting way of looking at curriculum. But I love what you said about streamlining
Mm,
because when you start mapping curriculum, and anyone out there listening that's tried to map curriculum, how do you decide what are the essential elements that are going to go into your curriculum mapping? Because I'm trying to think of the times that I've sat down and with other teachers, with administrators. I mean, at my IB school in Oman, we basically decided because we were so dissatisfied with ManageBack that we just were going to create our own system.
Right.
And that process was really, as a young teacher especially, was really it had a big impact on me in seeing really the importance of curriculum mapping. But it was
A
at times a very
process.
frustrating process, and part of it was deciding what's going to go into the curriculum map, because you say, well, okay, there's essential skills, essential content, your statement of inquiry. But then suddenly, well, do we also need to include, what about these standards? Because we are teaching some British students. What about adding, do we want to add how many essential questions? And then suddenly this
Becomes a
curriculum
monster.
map is like, 5 dimensional. What do you, when you think of curriculum mapping or even storyboarding, if we're going to go with Heidi's metaphor idea, what are, what what has to go into curriculum mapping in your view?
That is such a beautiful question. I think, well, I think like let's talk about who needs to be at the table and what
Mm,
resources they need to be
please.
successful first.
Yeah.
Right? So if we're going into a curriculum mapping process, you need like clear and intentional teams. So in elementary school, that's going to look more like, the grade 5 team all sitting together first. I think first starting just like across your year level what's being taught. High school, middle school is where it gets trickier because you have not only like subject that you've got to figure out, but also
Hmm.
like interwoven. So I would say go by subject level. That was probably your first starting point. So who's at the table? Then like what do they need to be successful? And I think a question you asked there is like, what are the curriculum standards? So Heidi's work is really beautiful is because she says curriculum standards are not your curriculum. They are a skeleton, right? They're taxonomies of what we expect kids to know.
Yeah, she even said, I like how she said, like, you're using the standards. You're not just sort of taking this group and putting them in there. You're using them to help tell the story.
Right.
You need to find how they're going to help you tell the story, not just sort of like grab this chunk and throw it in there just to show that you covered it.
Yes. But that being said, I think there needs to be clarity on which
Mm,
curriculum standards we've chosen and why as a school, and that those aren't dirty and bad in themselves. So, like, if your school is using NextGen, awesome. Like, if your school is using Common Core, awesome. If you're using something you've created in house, awesome. But I think everybody needs to know that. And everybody needs to know that, like, this is what we're all saying that we're having fidelity to.
mhm,
How and when and where you teach those throughout the year, how you bundle those to make sense, that's where the artistry and the flexibility and the creativity comes into things.
mhm,
But that, like, having a shared set of curriculum standards, I think is step one. Step two, then I think is bundling and grouping those, creating like a scope and sequence.
mhm,
And then from there, I think you can pull out those big ideas. So the big understandings, the big concepts, and those are what you use to craft your story. Like those are what you use to communicate with learners. Because if you give them a list of 20 content standards, ugh, as a teacher, that's hard to work with. So
yeah.
imagine you're 8 years old seeing that. It's nonsense. But as a teacher, your job is to do that cognitive work, that load of saying, these are the big important things we're going to understand and take forward. I think would be, I don't know if that adds any clarity, but that would be my biggest advice.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think one of the hallmarks of progressive education is emphasizing depth over breadth,
Yeah,
right? And I think that creates a natural tension because some of these standards are just
bonkers.
they're so long,
Yeah.
and they're so um, wide. So, what do you make of that tension?
So, what I would say there is we have a beautiful new tool to help us with that work, which is AI. Like, honestly,
Mhm.
this is one of those skills. So, I always tell this story in workshops that I was working at a school in Thailand, and I think the best principal ever, but she goes saying, Cindy, I just think that the teachers need more time to unpack their curriculum. And I was like, yeah. And then she kept saying it, unpack their curriculum, unpack their curriculum. And it felt like, are you a Schitt's Creek fan?
Yes, of course.
Just fold it in, David.
Yeah.
Just fold in the cheese, you know? And I was like, what does it mean to unpack? And so finally she walked me through this process of like taking this standard that's worded with all this academic language and mumbo jumbo and just saying, okay, let's break this. What will kids know? What will they understand? What will they be able to do? And I was like, oh, that's so simple. Like unpacking your curriculum is just parsing it for yourself as a
Mhm.
teacher. But that is such hard work to do, especially when we had these lists. I tell you what, pop those lists of standards into ChatGPT or Gemini
Mhm.
and say, break this into easy to understand knowledge, understanding, and skills for this unit. Awesome. Now break this into a 6-week scope and sequence of what I would likely teach first, next, then, and last.
Mhm.
This is work that takes teaching teams hours to do that can be now done in 5, 7 minutes. You go back and forth, you edit it based off of your students, you add in context, and it's done.
Mhm. We could probably spend the next hour on AI.
Yeah.
Um, and I know AI in education is currently it's a new and I would say controversial among with some people. Um, a topic. I will say though, I wholeheartedly agree with what you just said.
Mm,
Um, I quick plug for Google's new Notebook LM. If any educators out there have not used this for projects, particularly projects that require a lot of heavy lifting, like curriculum development, it is really incredible. And to what you just said, it can help us um, streamline our thinking too. Take some of the mental load off because it will do a lot of organizing and sorting for you.
so awesome. Yeah, and I think as we become more confident with AI, like Ethan Mollick describes AI as a general technology, so like the steam engine. And I think the best thing that we can do as leaders in this space is not have separate AI workshops. That like
Mm.
when we're talking about curriculum, there should be automatically a section of AI embedded in that. If we're talking about grading or aligning our grading practice, there should automatically be an AI section that just as every teacher is a literacy teacher, I think that every teacher is an AI teacher. And that is our mindset and our shift that we need to make is that it's an embedded part of our practice.
That is a shift, Cindy. I'm going to say, in my experience, what I see, that's why these are controversial because I do think there's a lot of teachers out there that are very resistant to AI, and I think a lot of it's just maybe lack of experience with it, or
Mm,
and the fear of what students might do with it. Back to the curriculum mapping, though, just to add the IB element to it, because there's also the approaches to learning.
woof.
There's the learner profile and the approaches to learning. I mean, as a
Beast of its
as a
own.
list of dispositions, it's really incredible, but it's thorough. I'll say that. And so, how about for an IB educator who is either feels they need to or is told that hey, these I need to see this in your curriculum planning as well. So now you've got
Mhm.
all the other things we talked about, and I need to see ATL integration. I need to see how the learner profile is showing up.
Yeah.
What do you say to those teachers?
I'd say that the IB is the UBD, is beginning with the end in mind,
Mhm.
right? And that if we look at it that way, everyone is responsible for teaching the same thing knowledge, understanding, and skills. And in a way, the IB framework, don't think of it as an add on. It's a way of making your life easier. So rather than having to think to yourself, like, woof, what skills am I going to teach in this unit? The ATL are just one of the frameworks that you have to support your planning. So when I'm thinking about knowledge and understandings, those are mostly for me content. They're coming from my subject standards and curriculum, you know? When I turn towards skills, I think of skills in three parts. There's disciplinary skills. And again, that's going to come from your content. You know, what are the skills of a scientist? What are the skills of an artist or of what's a PE person called? It athlete?
Uh,
He said, what are your disciplinary skills?
mm,
And then from there, we then turn towards our ATLs, which is they used to be called transdisciplinary
mhm.
skills. I so much prefer that language to approach to learning because I think approach to learning is kind of confusing. So your transdisciplinary skill is just like zooming out and saying, not what we're just working on in math and not just what we're working on in science, but what are we working on above all of that? That like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when they're not learning graphing, but when they're out in the world and AI comes into their lives, what skills are they going to have to be able to solve those problems? And how can we start to build the language and skills and dispositions of that
Hmm.
now? So
Yeah.
that's how I think of ATL. It's like I'm working on all of these disciplines, disciplinary skills, and the overarching skill that connects them together, that's my ATL.
Yeah. I think common language across teachers and disciplines helps there. I love this quote. You interviewed Guy Claxton, and he said, "Deep down at the bottom of the river where the big fish live, those big fish are these dispositions of independence, adventurousness, resourcefulness, collaborativeness, intellectual humility, open-mindedness, skepticism, and so on."
Oh, I love
And
him.
and later said, dispositions are the skills we are disposed to use. And I
Yeah.
thought it was just a really great way of getting to the heart of why we would try to teach these things, to everything you just said. Because 10 years later, that's as the world continues to change, those are the skills that are going to make people flexible and adaptable.
Well, and to continue on dispositions, another piece of Guy's thinking that I think is really beautiful is he says that skills are great. They're your ability to do something in the world.
Mm.
But dispositions are your willingness and readiness to do those things independently. So the example I use in workshops is six pack abs. Do I have the skills to build six pack abs? Do I know the diet? Do I know the exercises I should do? Yes, I have the skills, but do I have the dispositions?
Mm.
Clearly not, right? So it's that fact that
I
learners
believe in
should,
you, Cindy.
what do you say?
I believe in you.
You shouldn't. It's not happening for me, and I've accepted that. But we know that our learners are going to be out in the world learning independently. And so the dispositions just go hand in hand with that it's that willingness and readiness and ability to independently put what we've learned into practice.
Mm.
And again, the IB helps us in that way because the learner profile attributes, those are the dispositions we're all working on from PYP to DP. Schools that don't have the learner profile, I suggest Ron Richart's work. He has studied dispositions back and forth, and he's got a set of six of them that are a beautiful set. If you're just hearing about dispositions for the first time, his work is a gorgeous place to turn towards.
Okay. Yeah, the independence thing is interesting, right? Can
Mm.
be, I think even it was Heidi who said that that if you take any statement of or any goal, learning target for your students, if you add the word independently at the
Mm,
end, that's when it really becomes magical, right? I can, you know, write a claim evidence and reasoning paragraph
mm,
independently. I can
right.
complete, the formula independently. And I wonder how much sometimes our curriculum planning has that in mind, that the
Mm.
ultimate goal is not just for us to cover things, but for the students to internalize it and be able to do it independently.
Well, to transfer it to new and novel
Transfer.
situations and
Mm,
contexts. That's our ultimate goal is
mm,
not to be successful today. Being
mm,
successful today is great, but it's almost like a formative assessment. And the summative assessment is life, to be able to thrive and learn and be capable and happy and joyous in life.
yeah, absolutely. When I was first starting this podcast, I was I had like a couple episodes. I was experimenting with, could I even do this? I had um, done podcasting with my students and realized like, oh, I could do this myself.
The
And
beauty
I
of
just had
being
it.
an IB teacher, you realize things you're doing for your kids, you can do for yourself.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I could do it independently. And there's a couple episodes in, and I was just really just kind of figuring out. And I always be grateful to her, but for my third episode, Julie Stern came on the show, and I just, even looking back, I think back on her and talk about transfer. Her
Oh,
work on transfer, particularly
gorgeous.
conceptual transfer, is so powerful. Can you talk a bit about what you learned from your conversation with Julie? Because this idea of transfer and really talk about depth over breadth. This is her work really gets into that and developing strong thinkers, flexible thinkers.
Gosh, Julie's one of those masters that you hear her speak, and it's a concept. It's a concept I feel pretty familiar with. I've read it lots of places, have thought a lot about it, and it was just like, oh, you are in it. The different types of transfer she unpacks in that episode. Like it really is. It's a worthwhile one just to go listen to
Mhm.
because it's a masterclass. I could not summarize it, but just I don't. To me, it really drove home the point that transfer is the driving why behind absolutely everything we do as educators. And that if we're not beginning with that as our end in mind, then we're failing from the start. That
Mm.
like so much of what we do in the education space is scaffolded and supported. So what happens when we kind of release those barriers? Do kids have the skills to do that on their own? It's just, yeah, it's one of those wonderings and questions that I continue to take forward into everything I do.
Sure. And the IB actually is set up for this really well with key
Really well.
concepts.
And the
And
transdisciplinary themes too are a
absolutely.
really big lever for that.
Yeah. And so I'd say any IB teacher, that's to me, that's the why of those structures in the IB to
Right.
using that common language and helping students develop that kind of ability to transfer these big ideas subject to subject and also just subject to life.
Well, and that's I think why it's so interesting to go from the IB into progressive schools because so much of like what the this sounds condescending, but like so much of what the IB figured out 15, 20 years ago
Mm.
really are just starting here in the States in these schools and like are new, big, overwhelming ideas. And so I think if you are an independent school and you're feeling the struggle, like I want to be more intentional about curriculum, the IB has a lot. The framework is a really beautiful thing. And it's one of those pieces, the more you figure out about the IB, the more that you learn about other educational theories and practices, the more that you're like, dang, like they did a really good job with this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of success just even using the subject criteria.
Right.
They're
Oh,
just
I'm
because I
so
think
jealous for
sometimes in
IB teachers.
well, it's just sometimes back to our idea of the master teacher that has
Mm,
the great course, but is it going to live on after they leave? Often I find that teachers are doing this incredible work in the classroom. The learning experiences are amazing. Their assessments are amazing. But when you try to pin down what actually it is they are like grading kids on, it
woof.
quickly becomes very fuzzy.
Yeah.
And that's where I think just the clarity of the criteria to your point about progressive schools can learn from the IB, that's one to me that's really clear.
Right. And I think again, IB is UBD, is backwards design, is the best practice is best practice. So as a school leader, if you're not using IB, getting everybody rowing in the same direction of in this 6 week span of time, what do we expect every student to know, understand, and be able to do? And that everybody in your team should be able to answer that question without getting offended.
Mhm.
It's a non-negotiable. When you have that language, assessment culture changes because then it's really simple. The how to
Mhm.
is how do I know what they already know and understand and can be able to do? What's the next step in getting them there? And then how will I know? And what's the next step in getting them to the next step? Like
Mhm.
it changes your culture of assessment because it makes the goalpost clear as opposed to kind of murky and assumed and ambiguous.
Yeah. And it really is all about assessment.
It
You
is.
know, starting, Jay McTighe, right? It's like Jay McTighe or Kevin Bartlett, just their clarity on the importance of starting at the end. And what I love too is how much they emphasize formative assessment.
Yes.
What
Process over product.
Yes, and I got to interview Jay a few years ago. Another one
He's
of
such a
these, as we
sweetheart.
said before. People always say yes.
Yeah.
I was like Jay McTighe, sure, he said yes to me. I'm kind of surprised right now, but and his metaphor that I've repeated many times and hopefully credit him every time I've done it. That you wouldn't to prepare a basketball team for a game. You wouldn't just have practices that were looking at plays on paper,
Right.
right? You'd have them actually practice the thing before they did the game. And I've always loved that metaphor as the formatives really need to be explicit at practice for that summative, like you're trying to get them somewhere. And
Right.
that somewhere, they need to have a chance to practice that somewhere before they get there.
I love that. Yeah. And beyond, like, I think so many times we get wrapped up in those summative assessments, these like big like
Mhm.
shows, these products, the final paper, the whatever. And like eh, my thinking on summative assessments is that by the time you get there, there should be no surprises. You should have evidence of students' capability in every single thing that's going to be assessed on the summative. And like the summative should show growth from the last formative assessment, but it shouldn't be a shock, you know?
Mhm.
And that's when people are like, but the kids are going to use AI to cheat and we're not going to know it. I'm like, then you're not assessing properly because you should have 15 pieces of evidence to go, whoa, whoa, whoa. You went from here to here to here to here. Like you should be able to show that evidence. It helped
Yeah,
me understand how your thinking changed and went from here to here. When you see those kinds of leaps, that's how you know AI has come into the picture. But if you've been collecting evidence along the way, there shouldn't be the ability for those kinds of surprises.
sure. Yeah, that like really authentic documentation. It promotes such great conversations with
Oh,
students and their families, and yeah, absolutely.
rich data.
Yeah, yeah. I had such a great like proud moment recently, just seeing my. I was looking over my daughter's shoulder. She's in an IB school,
Oh,
and
yeah.
she was on her Toddle, and she was looking at the rubric for the assessment she was working on, and she was looking through the all the criteria, and then she was telling me about how she had the practice she'd had on a formative. She already knew the rubric, and she was working. And I thought, oh, this is just great, and just to watch her use it like that was really a gratifying thing to see.
Well, can you fathom how different your life would be if you'd learned that skill when you were
So
12 years old, when you were 15 years old? Like the ability to go, okay, let me look back at what success looks like
yeah,
and use that to inform my performance. Like, what? That's not how we looked at rubrics. When I was a kid, you looked at rubric as the thing that you got at the end that told you did a good job or a bad job. It didn't inform the entire process. And I think, like, as teachers, if we can begin with the end in mind and make that clear, then
mhm,
learners develop that skill as well. And I think that, again, assessment capability is just transfer of assessment skills.
sure. Maybe just showing my age here, but I don't think I'd even heard of rubrics until I became a teacher. I think when I was a kid, it was like,
Fun.
this is a fun class. I like my teacher. And then the report card comes like B plus. Like, all right, cool. I guess I got a B plus this class. I don't know. Couldn't
Yeah,
tell you
just a
why.
random score.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like literally just like, that's it. That's all it says. But yeah, we've moved on since then. So on this last point of me having the proud dad moment, let's talk
Yeah.
about Toddle. Toddle's a really incredible tool. I'll say that.
It's cool.
I don't use Toddle currently, so this is not me just product placing right now. But uh, it's it's remarkably effective in communicating with all stakeholders. I think that's what I love
Mhm.
about it the most. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how Toddle um, works for students and how it works for teachers and why it is so effective.
Gorgeous. So we started in IB schools and we started as like a school solution. So in Ahmedabad, India, they have two schools there and they realized that their teaching teams were using like I think 15 different platforms.
Mm,
So, one for lesson planning, one for curriculum planning, one for assigning students, one for communicating with families. And it was just chaos. And they're like, okay, how do we create one interconnected ecosystem to do all of this? And that's really where Toddle has been born from. And that's where we've iterated from is this idea of teachers do a lot. How do we capture that in one beautiful and integrated space? So to me, it kind of all begins with with the curriculum piece. I think that's part of why it's so hard for progressive schools, or not hard for them, but it's just a shift in thinking, is that Toddle believes that teachers are curriculum designers, right? So it
yeah,
begins with a canvas, it begins with a space to say, what do we think is worth learning?
sure.
When in the year do we think is worth learning it? And how do we design that in an interconnected way? Schools upload their own sets of standards, and then teachers use those to create their own curriculum maps. That's like the primary first teacher work. From there, it also supports all of your lesson planning. So I've got my curriculum map. Within that, I can say, here's my 6-week unit. Here's my lesson plan. I'm going to tag the learning goals I'm teaching today. I'm going to use AI to generate my lesson plan. Boop. And then I'm
Mhm.
going to assign that to students. So all of that teaching, all of that thinking work and mapping and planning is happening in one space, but also the student side is happening, as you said
Right.
there. So on the student side of it, I'm receiving a piece of work. It's got clear learning intentions for me. I've got a portfolio to record my thinking and record my growth and respond with my teacher. Um, and then my family get to see that too. So it's kind of one space where we all can see the learning and teaching that's happening. Also, then we zoom out at the end of the year. I can look back and get insights into which standards were taught when, how many times, how did kids do? Are there any gaps in my curriculum? Are there any areas where we focused on a lot and areas we neglected? So it's just, it's clarity and it's beauty. And it's one space that tells the full story of learning from big picture planning to daily planning to students completing the work and what that means for us as a team.
And I should point out that Toddle is not just for IB teachers.
Right.
So someone listening who's if this sounds wonderful, but you think, well, I'm not in an IB school.
IB. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a UBD. Um,
We've got a UBD template, and we also, it's completely customizable, which was
mhm.
part of the intention of the design, is that however your school, whatever language and culture your school has around planning, Toddle can be set up to mirror that.
Mhm. Yeah. You talked about workshops earlier. You give workshops as part of your.
Yeah.
What workshops do you give, and what do you hear from teachers about their own work with curriculum and their own journey and sort of creating their curriculums?
So the work I'm most passionate about right now is probably that intersection of AI and curriculum.
Mm,
So on Monday, I was in a school in Houston, a full day workshop on just first kind of the basic, getting everybody moving on the basics of AI. But then we shifted towards, okay, how do we use this to design ChatGPT proof assessments? And to me, the way we do that is everything that you and I have talked about together today. It's being clear about our curriculum, having strong learning goals, and then from there, designing, Katie Novak of UDL says, firm goals, flexible means, right?
mm.
So the how to is flexible in your class, but what we're working towards is shared. And I think that is the biggest kind of aha moment for all teachers is that same aha moment for me of the importance of unpacking your curriculum, and
Yeah.
being clear on what we're going to know, understand, and be able to do across audiences across the world. That tends to be a really big nugget that is transformative to practice.
Wow. Um, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the you had a couple episodes with Trevor McKenzie.
Yes.
Um, he's really
Trevor's
wonderful.
sitting
Very.
next to me. I'm so excited.
There you go. But I was thinking about his. He talked about learning journeys, I think, and how I kind of because my head was still kind of an assessment, and he was talking about grading and how grading, sort of inhibits the learning journey and the story that we're telling in our classrooms. But I wonder, in your experience, where I'm going with this is how much do external top-down pressures, college applications,
Mm,
extracurriculars, building that portfolio that starts to happen when students now it's not even in high school anymore, it's now in middle school. How much does that start to um frankly, like, hurt
undermine.
the student's learning journey, the student's authentic, and I'm thinking about it in terms of the curriculum. We want to build these experiences, we want to backwards plan to ensure that there's transfer, but how much is the outside world making that increasingly difficult, do you think?
I think a revolution is starting. I think it started with COVID,
Mm,
and it started when the ACT and the SAT kind of got put on pause. Or I guess me backwards trying to say that I think that the biggest barrier right now is the college admissions process, and that, like, especially in the high school, you see it even in the DP that schools are readying that like transition into college as their primary function,
yeah.
which we know is no longer serving learners. A lot of our students aren't going to attend college, or their college experience is going to be really, really different. And that revolution is starting to happen. We're seeing shifts. We're seeing things like the Mastery Transcript Consortium that's moving away from a transcript with just a letter grade.
I love that organization.
They're so cool.
Oh wow. Okay, good. Sorry.
Well, and a new report, I think was it Joe Feldman just came out with a new report about grade inflation. And that like so much of what gets put into a final grade is so bizarro. It's like it's attendance. It's did you do your homework? It's did you were you nice to everybody in class? It's not purely academic.
Oh, and that's what going back to the point about the power of using the criteria,
Right.
showing
What are we
teachers.
assessing
Yeah,
on?
exactly. What you have to be able to show me how you're assessing each of these in your assessments, not the homework completion, not the yeah, exactly. Did you show up on time? I mean, yeah,
But
sure.
until we align behind that as educators, until
Mhm.
we make that part of our professional practice, we invite things like standardized testing and
Mm.
SATs. Because how the heck else will a college know what a kid is capable of if what an A means in Texas is different than what an A means in Florida? They need some kind of a standardizing body. But I think my hope in general is that we start to see standardized testing. I don't think it's a bad thing. But I think it's the floor and not the ceiling. I
Mm.
think if you're doing great practices, your kids should be able to show basic reading and writing and math proficiency. That shouldn't be like a scary thing that we like bulk away from. Like our kids should be able to show that competency and that ability. But ideally it becomes more the floor and that we have more space for that storytelling that the number and that final weird test isn't what's driving the bus.
Yeah, we use the international schools assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I say, and it to your point, it really serves exactly that purpose. I think it's a really quality standardized test, but it gives some really helpful information without becoming the whole story. And
It's
it's
not
actually
it's
prompted some
one piece
really
of data.
yeah, and it's prompted actually some really great conversations with families. We have meetings, the curriculum. Um, our curriculum head meeting with parents to kind of go through what the ISA is, what it isn't, and what that means for their student,
Yeah.
and without becoming, the thing that we're obsessing over.
Totally. Yeah, and I'll say that again for the room in the back. Like your kids should be able to perform on these tests.
Yeah,
These are supposed to show basic proficiency, and I think maybe that means changing those tests too. Of what exactly are they assessing, and what does success on those tests look like? But yeah, if those are what's driving the bus of your school, like woof, like
sure,
there's so much more important curriculum.
sure. So you're really interested in AI.
Really, really interested in AI.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you've done a few episodes on yeah. What are your what have you gleaned so far about what the near future in education looks like with AI? I mean,
Okay.
I'll say this as somebody who I'm quite interested in AI myself, and as I mentioned before, I do use a couple um, different products, but it's very fascinating in the education space right now. I think because there is something so human about teaching, and then
Yes.
when you introduce AI, it's just a really interesting tension there. And I'm curious what you've gleaned so far.
Well, let's talk about where AI already is in education. So, like, Toddle's goal with AI is to save teachers 10 hours per week. And I would say we're pretty nearing that goal.
Mm.
So, AI is already being used in the lesson planning process. So, anything that's iterative, brainstorming, where there's not one right answer and you're trying to create multiple options, AI is amazing at. So, things like lesson planning, definitely using it for that. Um, we're already using AI for reporting. So if you've already collected all this evidence and data, why do you have to spend 3 hours writing comments? Let
Mm.
AI make the first draft of that. We're using it for family communications, that weird, hard letter that you spend 40 minutes thinking how to say that he won't stop like putting his hands in his mouth and not sound mean when I say that, right?
Mm.
So the parent communication, and we just released AI tutors. So that's the student facing AI. Think of it like another form of formative assessment where kids are interacting with an AI that a teacher has assigned and you're getting insights into their performance. So all of this is already happening, is already like well established, working well in classroom spaces. What I think is coming very soon, like I would say in the next year or two, is the shift is towards what's called AI agents. So the idea is that rather than AI happening like siloed and in isolation and like using it for specific isolated tasks, you're going to have agents that are able to perform multiple tasks. So like um, a student comes in and they like do their assignments, and the AI agent will be able to like grade the few assignments, notice that they are performing differently in another classroom, and we'll be able to schedule a meeting between you and that teacher to talk about what are you doing differently than what they're doing so that you guys can come together to make a learning plan. Right. So it will start to take actions on account of students, that every student will have their own agent or every teacher will have their own agent who's aware of the kind of whole ecosystem of their performance and is
Mm.
able to spot things sooner for us. Ultimately, I think the function of all of this will be saving time, catching patterns more quickly, and having a more personalized learning experience for our learners.
Wow. The saving time and the seeing patterns, I think, um, it sounds great, and I think a
Right.
lot of teachers would get behind that. That last point, though, creating a more how do you say it, a more authentic learning,
Personalized.
personalized. That was it, personalized learning experience. I do think I that's where I'm still a little stuck on seeing uh, that.
Have you played with tutors?
I have not.
Play with tutors.
Okay.
So there are some free ones out there you can fiddle with. Um, but it comes back to research that came out in 1984. Bloom came out with what he called the two sigma problem,
Mm,
which was that he did three comparative analysis: traditional classroom, a mastery based classroom, and a classroom where students receive one on one tutoring. The students who received one on one tutoring went from performing in the bottom of the class or the middle of the class to the top 2 percentile. They outperformed by two sigmas, like just crazy next level high performance. And so, like, the how to of great learning has been really clear. Kids need personalized, individualized learning paths. The how to has always been impossible because you've got one teacher and limited resources. And to me, AI is the bridge between the theory we've known and the practice we've not had the resources to implement.
yeah. We're talking about feedback.
Immediate feedback, immediate personalization, immediate insights into teachers, into what's working and what's not working, 24-hour support. So if I learn best at 3 in the morning and I have a question, I can go and talk to an ever patient AI who can support me. All the benefits of
Sure.
private tutoring that were reserved for the rich and the wealthy and the very
Mhm.
privileged are now accessible to more and more learners every single day.
Okay. I like it. I like it, Cindy. I
It's
just
dope. I'm
okay.
so excited about it.
Cool. I mean, I've shown students how to take a piece of writing and just ask chat for feedback on it.
Right.
And it's great. It's just that sometimes what then chat does is say,
Here's a better version.
here's a better version. And
And that's the difference between tutors is they have the guardrails that they won't do that.
okay. You're right. Because it's so difficult. I was even thinking about this yesterday, that how teachers who have already been creating authentic writing tasks, writing prompts,
Mm,
I think right now they suddenly find themselves like way ahead,
yes.
right? Because they're already making tasks that aren't AI ready. They're
Yes.
this sort of text to self reflective writing tasks. Whereas I think teachers that have more sort of traditional writing prompts, writing assignments, are really freaking out
Yep.
because they're realizing that everything they give the student to write about is just can go right into chat. And even for something though where I'm having them do writing that I feel like is pretty authentic, to ask chat for some feedback and to run the risk of chat just saying here's a better version, as you say, and then
Mhm.
it just feels kind of gross, because it's like, am I kind of undoing all the great learning we've done? Because at the end of this, what they've seen is that actually chat just gives a great version of it. So this tutors is an interesting.
But the thing is, they're going to have access to that in their workplace. And
Mhm.
so the question of our generation is not if AI can. AI can, and it probably can
Sure.
do it better
Sure.
than you, right?
Yeah.
It's what work is worth my cognitive load?
Mhm.
And having that discussion with students of, okay, this is our success criteria for the unit. Let's talk about why this is important in your life. And let's talk about what you've already shown mastery of. If
Mhm.
you've already shown mastery of it and you know how to do it with proficiency, go ahead, use ChatGPT to do it. But if you can't yet, and you're going to use ChatGPT as a crutch, and you're never going to learn that skill, how might that impact you later on?
Mhm.
And so that, I mean, if we're doing that thinking for our students, this is worth their cognitive load, so I'm going to ban ChatGPT because they have to be able to do it. We're robbing of them of that autonomy, that agency to make that choice of, I'm choosing to do this work, not because it's going to be faster for me to do it by myself, but because it's work worth doing.
Yeah, no, I agree for sure. I'm not, I think students need to know how to use these tools because, as you
Yeah.
said, I mean, I use them. So why would make sense for me
Right.
to say they can't use them? And I think asking the right questions, I think is a big part of that too.
Mm,
I was listening to someone recently say that this is the first time in history that computers speak our language.
mm.
Right. Previously, if you ever wanted to talk to a computer, you had to be a
Talk to it
coder,
like a machine.
talk to like a machine, right? It's also the first time that computers have open-ended, infinite possibilities for how it might respond. It's
Yep.
not a menu that you're clicking on, a button you're pushing where it's only going to do certain things. So how you talk to chat, how you talk to a chat bot, the questions you ask, because if you ever seen like a middle school student, I'll say, for example, use Google, sometimes it's remarkable to me. Like they'll just take a full sentence prompt and just type it into Google, right? It's like the idea of like keywords, and it's like, oh, okay, that doesn't actually just come naturally. You have to really teach that because they're just putting full on sentences in there. And the same thing for chat. How you talk to a
Learnable.
chat bot is, I think, what you're asking is as important as what you get back.
Well, and Ethan Mollick's advice is my favorite in this. He says, don't think of it like a machine. Think of
Mm,
it like an alien human. Like it's like a human that just thinks really differently than you do. Right. And so when you're prompting, if you think it like it is more like a human than a machine. And it's a weird new skill to learn, but gosh, is it fun to play with?
it really is. It really is. Okay, so as we come to the end here, just to bring it back to curriculum, love to end my episodes with advice. What advice my guests can give teachers who are listening. Um, so, for a teacher out there who is in maybe a curriculum review process, is
Mm.
rethinking their own curriculum, maybe has been frustrated with their curriculum, maybe came to a Frankenstein school and said, "What is this?" Google Drive, great. There's some folders I can't make. Uh, uh, you know, um, what's the phrase? Heads or tails? Um, what advice would you give that teacher? Where to start? What are some things that they could do today to start the process of making their curriculum awesome?
Great question. Figure out what exists first. I think that's the key thing is there's going to be somebody in your school that might be your curriculum person, that might be a principal, and just ask about it. And this can be kind of a sensitive question, but just get clear on like what exists already and what standards are we all working from. I think is the biggest one that like often gets missed by new teachers in a school. It's like nobody ever mentions, oh yeah, we're using Common Core. And it's like, I wish I had known that. So get clear on that. Like what exists, what are the boundaries that already exist for me? And then start with just one unit and just think to yourself, okay, I'm an expert here. What is most important? If I've got 6 weeks, what should every single student know, understand, and be able to do? And if you're struggling with that, use AI to help you. But get just really crystal, super duper clear on what every single student would need to know, understand, and be able to do to show success. And I think if you do that, honestly, the rest really falls into place. I think it was Yang Jiao that says, I believe anybody can do the how to, right?
Mm,
Especially with AI, we can do the how to, but it's figuring out that what is the base first and working backwards from there. Begin with the end in mind.
Love it. Um, any book recommendations for teachers out there?
Most transformative read for me as a teacher was Rachel French's
Mm,
Concept Based Inquiry in Action. And I think it was beautiful as an IB teacher. I think it'd be even more groundbreaking if you're not an IB, because it would just expose you to a lot of the ideas you and I have talked about today. It's a beautiful curriculum agnostic way of thinking about these things. So, hands down, that book.
that was a great interview too. Your interview with her, that
So
episode.
that one was like a dream come true, because she's one of those people who just loomed larger than life, because that book was so transformative for me.
Mm,
And yeah, that was a very special moment for me.
okay, and make sure to link all this in the show notes so people can find them. Um, so fun, Cindy, talking with you. You're just you just a fountain of ideas and knowledge, and
Oh,
love your podcast. I mean, it's so cool, and you get great people and ask great questions. And I think for any educator out there wanting to know where education's going, I think that's what I love most about your podcast, is that it's very future focused,
oh,
and it's thinkers who are um, talking about where we're headed rather than where we've been.
I appreciate how much of it you've tuned into, and it was like a trip down memory lane for you to call up these like amazing conversations and pull them into this. So really artfully done, and just you're a really wonderful host.
Thanks, Cindy. All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.